the man who wrote the most difficult book in the English language, spent his fortune trying to prove his own daughter was not insane. She was a dancer once, strong, electric, the toast of avant-garde Paris. Critics said she could have been one of the great ones. Then, at 22, she walked off the stage and never came back. How does the daughter of the most celebrated writer of the century end up spending 30 years locked in an asylum, while her genius father swears to anyone who will listen that she is not sick, she is a visionary? Her name was Lucia Joyce. Her father was James Joyce, the author of Ulysses, a man hailed as a god of modern literature. He had one daughter, and by the time the century was done with her, she had been handled by more than 20 doctors, examined by Carl Jung himself, and abandoned in a hospital in a foreign country, where almost no one ever came to visit. 3 things tonight that the literary biographies left buried for 60 years. 1. The young assistant who broke her heart with a single sentence, a man who would later win the Nobel Prize. 2. What Carl Jung said about Lucia and her father, that the family could never forgive. 3. The suitcase of her letters, and what her own nephew did to them in 1988 to make sure the world would never hear her voice. Most people remember James Joyce as a genius. His daughter remembered him as the one man who refused to let her be saved. The first thing Lucia Joyce ever learned about the world was that it had no fixed ground under it. She was born on July 26, 1907, in the paupers' ward of a public hospital in Trieste, a port city that belonged, in that year, to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Her father was not yet famous. He was a broke, half-blind English teacher with a drinking problem and a manuscript no one wanted, scraping together lessons to feed a young family that had no money and no country. Lucia came into the world in the charity wing, among the poor of a city that was not her parents' home, in a language that was not her parents' language. That was the keynote of her entire childhood: motion, instability. No home. The Joyces moved and moved and moved again. Trieste, then Zurich, then Paris, then back, dragging the children across borders and through cheap rented flats, sometimes a different address every few months. By the time Lucia was a teenager, she had lived in dozens of apartments and spoken 4 languages, often muddled together Italian at home, French and German in the streets, English from her parents. She had no steady school. She had no childhood friends who lasted, because there was never time to make them before the next move. She grew up fluent in everything and rooted in nothing. And she grew up inside the gravitational field of one overwhelming fact: her father's genius. Everything in the household bent toward it. The money, when there was money, went to his work and his eyes and his drinking. The moves were for his career. The silence was for his writing. The family existed to orbit the great book he was always making. Her mother, Nora, a strong, plain-spoken, uneducated woman from Galway, who had run off with Joyce as a young woman, held the household together with sheer force of will, but she had little patience for art and less for her strange, intense daughter. Lucia adored her father. She was, by every account, his favourite. He doted on her in his distracted way, taught her, indulged her. But the love came wrapped inside a life that could give a sensitive child no stability whatsoever, no home, no country, no normal childhood, nothing solid to stand on. She would spend the rest of her life looking for something solid. For a few short years, in the dance studios of Paris, she thought she had found it. In the early 1920s, Paris was the center of the artistic universe, and Lucia Joyce walked straight into the middle of it. By then, her father was no longer a starving teacher. Ulysses had been published in Paris in 1922, banned and smuggled and worshipped, and James Joyce had become a literary celebrity, the most talked about writer alive, surrounded by patrons and disciples and admirers. The family finally had money flowing in from wealthy benefactors. And Lucia, a teenager in this electric city, discovered the thing that would become her own art, separate from her father's, the one territory that belonged to her alone. Dance. Not ballet the new thing, modern dance. And the wild expressive movement that was exploding through 1920s in Europe. Lucia threw herself into it with total seriousness. She trained for years, intensively, under some of the most important teachers of the era. She studied with Raymond Duncan, the brother of Isadora Duncan. She worked in the systems of Jacques Dalcroze and Margaret Morris. She trained with the dancers of the Jean Berling and Les Ballets Suédois Circle. This was not a rich girl's hobby. Lucia worked at it like a professional, for hours every day. For years, and she became genuinely, seriously good. People who saw her dance remembered it. She was striking on stage. Tall, lithe, fierce, completely committed. Critics took notice. One Paris reviewer, watching her perform, wrote that Lucia Joyce was her father's daughter, that she had the same gift for invention in her body that he had on the page, and that she might one day be spoken of as he was. She designed her own costumes. She invented her own choreography. She performed in serious venues to real audiences. In May of 1929, at a major dance competition in Paris, at the Bal Bullier, Lucia performed and reached the finals. By several accounts, when the judges gave the top prize to someone else, part of the audience rose up and chanted her name, shouting that the Irish girl had been robbed, that Lucia Joyce was the real artist on that stage. She was 21 years old. She had a future that was entirely her own. And then, within months, she gave it all up. Picture her at the very top, in 1929, because this is the highest she would ever stand. A young woman in a Paris studio, sweat on her skin, mirrors all around her, her body trained to the edge of something rare. She had spent years building a self that was not James Joyce's daughter. She had built Lucia Joyce, dancer, an artist in her own right, admired by people who had no idea who her father was and would not have cared. For a brief, shining stretch of months, she had her own name, her own audiences, her own art, her own future. It was the only time in her life she ever fully belonged to herself. Her father watched her dance with open delight. He saw in her movement, he said, the same creative fire that drove his own work, two artists in one family, the writer and the dancer, the word and the body. He believed she carried his gift forward in a new form. In his mind, Lucia dancing was Lucia at her most alive, most herself, most his. She stood at the center of the most exciting artistic city on earth, young and gifted and rising. And then the ground she had finally found began, once again, to move. The collapse of the dancing did not come all at once, and that is what makes it so painful. Around 1929, Lucia abruptly abandoned her dance career. The reasons given afterward never quite added up, and that confusion is itself a clue to what was coming. Some said she was told she lacked the physical stamina for a professional life, that her health could not sustain the punishing schedule. Some said her family quietly discouraged it, that it was not quite respectable, that the constant moving made sustained training impossible, that a daughter ought not to be on a public stage. Some said Lucia herself, after years of total dedication, suddenly lost her nerve and declared that she had no talent, that she would never be good enough, and simply stopped. What is clear is that the one thing Lucia had built for herself, the one stable identity, the one ground under her feet, was taken away or thrown away at exactly the moment she needed it most. And nothing replaced it. She was 22. The audiences were gone. The studio was gone. The self she had spent years making had no stage to stand on anymore. She drifted back fully into the orbit of her father's household, the genius father, the impatient mother, the constant moves, the life with no center but the great book being written upstairs. And into that emptiness, that exact moment of a young woman with nothing of her own left to hold, walked a quiet young Irishman with sad eyes. His name was Samuel Beckett. He was a brilliant, withdrawn young writer who had come to Paris to sit at the feet of the great James Joyce to assist him, to worship him, to learn. Lucia, adrift and aching and 22, fell completely in love with him. She believed he loved her back. She was certain of it. She began to imagine a future, a marriage, a way out of her father's shadow at last. She was wrong about all of it. And the moment she discovered how wrong, the first crack would open in her mind, and it would never fully close again. For a little while, in the late 1920s, Samuel Beckett was a fixture in the Joyce household, and Lucia let herself hope. He was 23 when he arrived in Paris. A tall, gaunt, painfully shy young man from Dublin, already marked by the brilliance that would one day win him the Nobel Prize. He had come to Paris and gravitated, as so many did, into the orbit of James Joyce. He became something between a disciple, an assistant, and a friend reading to the half-blind Joyce, running errands, taking dictation, talking with him for hours about literature in the way Joyce loved best. He was at the apartment constantly. He was, in the family's life, a near-permanent presence. And Lucia, watching this gentle, serious, gifted young man come again and again to her home, fell in love with him completely. From where she stood, it must have seemed obvious that he came for her. He was always there. He was kind to her. He talked with her. He took her out, to cafes and walks through the city. To a young woman who had just lost her art, who was hungry for something of her own, who had grown up believing that love might finally be the solid ground she had never had, Beckett looked like rescue. She built, in her mind, an entire future on him. She told her family, with total conviction, that she and Beckett were going to be together. She had no idea that Beckett was not coming to the apartment for her at all. He was coming for her father. In 1930, Samuel Beckett told Lucia Joyce the truth, and he did not soften it. He explained to her, plainly, that his visits to the Joyce household had nothing to do with romantic interest in her. He came, he said, to see her father. He admired James Joyce above all living men. He was there for the writer, for the work, for the conversation with genius. His feelings toward Lucia were not what she had imagined. There was no future. There had never been one. He was, in effect, ending something that on his side had never really begun. For Lucia, it was a catastrophe far larger than an ordinary heartbreak. Because it was not just that the man she loved did not love her. It was that, once again, as with the dancing, as with every move of her childhood, the ground had been an illusion. She had built a self, a future, a hope, on something that turned out not to exist. And worse, even the man she loved had come to her home only because of her father. Even in love, even in the one thing she thought was finally hers, she discovered that she was invisible, that the gravity of James Joyce's genius had pulled Beckett to the apartment, and she had simply mistaken herself for the reason. She was, yet again, the daughter standing in the doorway, while the world walked past her toward her father. She did not take it quietly. She became distraught, then volatile. The family was shaken by the intensity of her reaction, far beyond what they thought the situation warranted. There were scenes. There was weeping, then rage, then a kind of frantic insistence that would not settle. The Beckett rejection did not just hurt Lucia. It seemed to knock something loose in her that the family had perhaps half noticed before and chosen not to see. The Joyces did what the Joyces always did with trouble. They moved. They tried to distract her. They tried to marry her off to someone else. There was, soon after, an engagement to another of Joyce's young assistants, a man named Alex Ponisovsky, and for a brief moment it seemed she might be settled. She accepted his proposal at a celebratory lunch. And then, at the party held to mark the engagement, Lucia collapsed into a catatonic state and had to be carried out. The engagement dissolved. The thing that had come loose was not going back into place. The years from 1930 to 1932 were the years Lucia Joyce came apart, in full view of a family that could not or would not understand what they were seeing. Her behavior grew stranger and more frightening. She became prone to sudden rages, then to long silences. She would weep for hours. She set fires, small ones, but deliberate. She wandered off and disappeared into the city for days. She grew violent at times toward the one person closest to her, her mother, Nora. The conflict between Lucia and Nora became open warfare. Nora, practical and exhausted and frightened, increasingly could not cope with her daughter. The relationship between mother and daughter, never warm, curdled into something raw and dangerous. And in the middle of all this stood James Joyce, refusing, with every fibre of his being, to believe that anything was actually wrong. This is the heartbreak at the centre of the whole story. And you have to hold both sides of it at once. Joyce loved Lucia with a depth that was real and consuming. She was his favourite, his darling, the child he understood best, the one he believed shared his own creative soul. And precisely because he loved her that way, he could not accept that she was ill. He had built, in his own mind, an alternative explanation. And he clung to it against all evidence. Lucia was not mad. Lucia was like him. Her strange speech, her broken sentences, her flights of association, her visions. These were not symptoms, they were genius. She was a clairvoyante, he said. She saw things others could not. Her mind worked the way his worked, on a plane the ordinary world could not follow. He would point to his own writing, to Finnegan's Wake, the impossible dream language book he was composing in exactly those years. A book made of shattered words and free association and the logic of dreams, and he would say that he and Lucia were doing the same thing, that they were two of a kind, that what looked like her breakdown was actually the same fire that produced his masterpiece. Whatever spark of gift I possess, he said, has been transmitted to Lucia, and it has kindled a fire in her brain. It was the most loving and the most destructive thing a father could possibly have believed, because as long as Joyce insisted his daughter was a visionary, he could resist, delay, and undermine every attempt to actually treat her. So the family entered a years-long cycle that would define the rest of Lucia's life. Crisis, doctor, denial, release, collapse, repeat. Lucia would break down. She would be taken sometimes by force to a clinic, a sanatorium, a doctor. She was examined, over the following years, by a parade of more than 20 specialists across France, Switzerland, and beyond, the finest and most expensive mental health professionals in Europe. Because Joyce now had money and spent it without limit on her, they gave conflicting diagnoses. Some said cyclical insanity. Some said she was not insane at all, merely difficult, neurotic, badly brought up. Some began to use the new and terrible word that was just then entering the medical vocabulary: schizophrenia. And whenever a doctor moved toward a firm diagnosis of serious mental illness, Joyce resisted. He pulled her out. He sought another opinion. He insisted they were wrong, that they could not see what he could see, that they were ordinary men trying to measure an extraordinary mind. He blamed the doctors. He blamed Nora. He blamed the moves, the stress, the bad luck. He tried sea voyages and rest cures and changes of scene. He spent over these years the equivalent of a fortune money from his patrons, money meant to secure the family's future, pouring it into clinic after clinic while simultaneously refusing to accept what the clinics were telling him. The family hid the worst of it from the outside world. Lucia's condition was a private agony, managed behind closed doors, explained away to friends as nerves, as delicacy, as the strain of artistic temperament. The greatest writer of the age organized his entire late life around a daughter he would not call sick. And the longer he refused, the more the window for any possible help closed. By 1934, the situation had become unbearable, and the desperate family did the one thing left to do. They took Lucia to Zurich, to the most famous psychiatrist alive, the man who had broken from Freud to build his own map of the human mind, the explorer of the unconscious himself. Carl Gustav Jung. Jung would become the 20th doctor to examine Lucia Joyce. And what he concluded about Lucia, and about her father, and about the terrible thing that bound them together, would be the one diagnosis James Joyce could never, ever forgive. Carl Jung had, in a sense, already met Lucia Joyce before he ever laid eyes on her because he had spent the previous years reading her father. Jung had written an essay on Ulysses. It was not flattering. He found the book baffling, monstrous, a stream of consciousness that seemed to him to teeter on the edge of madness itself. A mind unspooling without anchor. Joyce had been deeply offended by it. So there was already bad blood between the writer and the psychiatrist before Lucia ever entered Jung's consulting room in 1934. It was a measure of the family's desperation that they brought her to him at all. Jung observed Lucia. He read her writing, her strange associative wordplay, the way language broke and recombined in her speech and on the page, and he saw something that struck him with great force. Something that became one of the most haunting clinical observations in all of literary history. He saw that Lucia and her father used language in almost exactly the same way. The same neologisms, the same dreamlike puns, the same shattering and reassembling of words, the same private logic that bent ordinary meaning. The father and the daughter spoke and wrote in the same broken, brilliant tongue. And this, Jung said, was the key to the whole tragedy. He famously described them as two people going to the bottom of a river. But with one crucial difference. The father was diving, the daughter was falling. James Joyce, Jung said, was doing voluntarily, as an artist in full control, what Lucia was doing involuntarily, as a person drowning. Same water, same depths. One swam in it by choice and called it art. The other sank in it and could not get out. It was a devastating thing to say to Joyce, because it cut both ways at once. It said, "Yes, you are right. You and your daughter are alike. You share the same strange mind." And it said, "That is exactly why she is sick and you are not, because what you can survive, she cannot." Her father's genius and her madness were made of the same material. He had simply been strong enough, or lucky enough, to ride it. Joyce rejected Jung's view utterly. He could not bear it. To accept Jung was to accept that Lucia was truly ill and worse, to accept that the very thing he had celebrated in her, the fire he said he had passed to her, was the thing destroying her. He took her out of Jung's care, as he had taken her from so many others. Jung later remarked that the ordinary daughter of an ordinary man might have done well enough, but that Lucia had been pulled under by her father's underworld, that she was, in his words, the victim of an animus, drowned in the same depths her father navigated as a master. The 20th Doctor had failed too. There would be no 21st miracle. After Jung, the long descent had no more plateaus. Through the middle and late 1930s, Lucia moved through a succession of clinics and maisons de santé, increasingly confined, increasingly treated as a permanent patient rather than someone who might recover. The treatments of the era were primitive and often brutal. She was subjected to the things mental patients were subjected to in those years: prolonged isolation, sedation, injections of bovine serum, even barbaric experiments with the idea that her own teeth might be poisoning her mind. Nothing helped. Nothing could have helped, because the medicine of the 1930s had no real understanding of, and no real treatment for, what was wrong with her. And around her, the world was darkening in a way that would finish what the illness had started. Her father's health was collapsing alongside her. Joyce was nearly blind now, exhausted, pouring out the last of himself into Finnegan's Wake, which he finally finished in 1939 after 17 years, a book that almost no one could read. The most extreme experiment in the history of English prose. He had spent those same 17 years watching his daughter speak the book's broken language, not as art, but as symptom. The masterpiece and the breakdown had grown up together, side by side, in the same household, out of the same fire. Then came the war. In 1939, the Second World War broke out, and the Joyce family scattered, fragile, with a hospitalized daughter, in occupied France, was thrown into chaos. As the Germans advanced, the family had to flee. And here the war committed its quiet, specific cruelty against Lucia Joyce. When the family escaped from France to neutral Switzerland in 1940, they could not take her with them. She was in a clinic at Pornichet, in occupied territory. The arrangements, the borders, the money, the danger it could not be done in time. The family fled to Zurich. Lucia was left behind in France. James Joyce did not live to see the war end, or to be reunited with the daughter he had left in France. In January 1941, in Zurich, Joyce collapsed from a perforated ulcer. He was operated on. For a day it seemed he might recover. Then he failed. On January 13th, 1941, James Joyce died in a Zurich hospital, 58 years old, one of the most celebrated writers who had ever lived, and, to the very end, a man who insisted that his daughter was not insane. He died still fighting that fight. In his final years, even as Lucia was confined and clearly beyond his reach, he never accepted the verdict of the doctors. He wrote of her with tenderness and with a stubborn, unbreakable faith in her gifts. He arranged his money, his anxious thoughts, his correspondence around her care and her future. Whatever else can be said about James Joyce as a father, and much can be said against him, no one ever doubted that he loved Lucia to the last beat of his heart. He simply loved her in a way that could not save her, and may have helped destroy her, because the form his love took was a refusal to let her be ill. When he died, the one person on earth who had fought hardest for Lucia wrongly, ruinously but ferociously was gone. And the people who remained did not fight for her at all. Nora, her mother, worn down by decades of conflict with her daughter, did not bring Lucia back into her life. Lucia's brother, Giorgio, had his own troubles and kept his distance. The benefactors who had funded Joyce's life had no obligation to his hospitalized daughter. Lucia, in occupied France, sick and alone, became a problem to be managed, a responsibility to be transferred, a person to be placed somewhere, and, slowly, forgotten. After the war, she was moved. In 1951, Lucia Joyce was transferred to St Andrew's Hospital, a psychiatric institution in Northampton, England. She was 44 years old. She would live there for the next 30 years. 30 years. Sit with that number, the way the whole tragedy lives inside it. Lucia Joyce entered St Andrews in 1951, and she did not leave it until she died in 1982. She spent 3 full decades longer than she had spent free, longer than her entire life before the asylum inside a single English psychiatric hospital in a country that was not her home, far from Paris, far from the dance studios, far from everyone who had ever watched her perform and chanted her name. And almost no one came. Her mother, Nora, died in 1951, the very year Lucia was transferred, so the woman she had fought with her whole life was gone almost as soon as the long imprisonment began. Her brother, Giorgio, visited rarely. The great web of admirers and scholars and disciples who orbited the name Joyce, who built careers on her father's every word, who treated his manuscripts as holy relics had, for decades, almost no interest in the living woman locked away in Northampton, who had shared his home and his language and his blood. She was not, by all accounts, in constant torment in those years. There were long stretches of calm. She did handicrafts. She had her cigarettes, which she loved. She could be lucid, sharp, even funny. Visitors who did come were sometimes startled by how present she was, how clearly she remembered the brilliant world she had once moved through, how vividly she could speak of Paris and her father. She was not a vegetable. She was a person, a whole, intelligent, once luminous person, living out a 30-year sentence for the crime of having been too fragile to survive the fire she was born into. In her later years, a small number of people finally began to come, a few biographers, a few relatives, eventually a devoted friend or two who recognized the human being inside the case file. They found her, again and again, more alert and more aware than anyone had led them to expect. One who knew her in those years insisted she was lonely far more than she was mad. She had been the dancer the crowd rose up for. Now she was a name in the footnotes of her father's biographies, smoking alone in a ward in Northampton, waiting. Lucia Joyce died at St Andrew's Hospital on December 12, 1982, at the age of 75. She had outlived her father by 41 years. She had outlived her mother by 31. She had outlived nearly everyone who had known her as the gifted young dancer of 1929. The teachers, the critics, the audiences, the man named Beckett who had broken her heart and gone on to win the Nobel Prize, and become one of the most revered writers of the century in his own right. Beckett, it should be said, never entirely forgot her. In his quiet way, he retained a kind of guilt and tenderness about Lucia for the rest of his life. But he did not save her either. No one did. She was buried in Northampton, not in Paris, not in Dublin, not beside her father in Zurich, in England, in the town of the hospital that had held her for 30 years, far from every place that had ever meant anything to her. The crowd that had once chanted her name was 60 years gone. There was no chant at the end. There was a quiet grave in a foreign town, for a woman the world had decided, long before, was nothing more than the mad daughter of a great man. That is how the official story ends. But the official story was not the truth, and the reason it survived for so long is the most disturbing part of all. Here is the thing that should make you angry. For most of the 20th century, the world heard only one version of Lucia Joyce, the mad woman, the cautionary footnote, the tragic lunatic daughter. You almost never heard her own voice, her letters, her words, her side, her account of the dance and the rejection and the doctors and the long imprisonment. There was a reason for that. The voice had been deliberately destroyed. Lucia, across her life, had written letters. So had the people around her letters about her, to her, full of her words and her story. Those documents survived. They sat in the family's possession. They were the key to recovering the real woman beneath the diagnosis. And in the late 1980s, the keeper of the Joyce estate, Lucia's own nephew, James Joyce's grandson, made a decision about them. A decision that would ensure the world would never fully hear Lucia Joyce speak for herself. We are about to see exactly what he did, and why. Lucia Joyce died in 1982. Within a few years, the fight over who she had really been turned into something almost without precedent in literary history, and it began with fire. The keeper of the Joyce flame was Stephen James Joyce, the writer's only grandson, the son of Lucia's brother Giorgio. He had inherited control of the James Joyce estate, and he guarded it with a ferocity that became legendary and dreaded among scholars across the world. He believed, sincerely, fiercely, that his family's privacy had been violated for decades by an army of academics who treated the Joyces not as human beings, but as raw material. He had grown up around Lucia. He had known her as his aunt, and he had decided that her dignity and the family's mattered more than the scholarship. So he did something that scholars still speak of with horror. In the 1980s, Stephen Joyce destroyed letters. By his own admission, he burned correspondence relating to Lucia letters. Lucia had written letters concerning her illness and her life. He stated openly that he had done it. He said the letters were private, that they were nobody's business, that Lucia had a right to her privacy even in death and especially in her madness, and that he would not allow her most painful and intimate moments to be picked over by strangers building careers on his family's suffering. He also revealed that letters from Samuel Beckett, written after Lucia's death, when Beckett learned that she was being written about, had been destroyed as well, at Beckett's own request, because they too touched on Lucia. Whatever was in those letters, Lucia's own account of the dancing, the rejection, the doctors, the asylum, her father, her decades of confinement, the inner life of the woman behind the diagnosis is gone, burned, unrecoverable. The single richest source of Lucia Joyce's own voice was deliberately turned to ash by the family that controlled it. You could call what the grandson did an act of cruelty, but look closer, and you see something far more unsettling because it was, in his mind, an act of love. This is the pattern that runs through Lucia Joyce's entire story, generation after generation. The people who damaged her most were the people who loved her, and they damaged her precisely through the shape their love took. Her father loved her so much that he refused to let her be ill, and in refusing, he undermined every doctor who might have helped her, kept her in a limbo of denial for the crucial years, and may have made her worse. His love was a refusal to see. Her grandson loved her so much that he refused to let her be seen. And in refusing, he burned the only documents that could have given her back, her voice, that could have let history know her as a person rather than a symptom. His love was a refusal to show. Both men acted to protect Lucia. Both men were certain they were defending her dignity against a world that would misuse her. And both men, in the name of that protection, took something irreplaceable away from her. The father took away her chance at treatment. The grandson took away her chance at being understood. Between them, across 50 years, the two men who loved Lucia Joyce most thoroughly erased her. First as a patient, then as a person. She spent her whole life as the object of other people's love, and that love kept deciding, on her behalf, what she was and was not allowed to be. "A genius," said her father, "not a patient." "A private tragedy," said her grandson, not a voice. At no point in the century did anyone with power over her simply ask what Lucia herself wanted to be. She was loved into silence. And yet against the fire, against the denial, against the footnotes, the real Lucia began, slowly, to come back. Because not everything was destroyed, and not everyone was willing to let her remain a punchline in her father's story. In the decades after her death, a handful of scholars and writers went looking for the actual woman. And what they found was not the gibbering madwoman of the legend, but something far more tragic and far more human. A genuinely gifted artist, a serious modern dancer. An intelligent and perceptive woman, caught in an impossible family at an impossible moment in the history of medicine, and crushed by forces that had little to do with her own supposed insanity. In 2003, a major biography by the scholar Carol Loeb Schloss, Lucia Joyce, To Dance in the Wake, tried to reconstruct her life and to argue that Lucia had been not merely a victim, but an artist and an influence, that her father had drawn on her, her movement, her language, her presence. In the writing of Finnegan's Wake itself, the book set off a fierce legal battle with the estate over the right to quote the very documents that had survived. The fight over Lucia's voice continued, in courtrooms, more than 20 years after her death. But the effort succeeded in something larger. It cracked the old story open. It forced the world to see that the mad daughter had been a real and gifted person, that the diagnosis that defined her had been made in an era that understood almost nothing, by doctors who disagreed with one another, in a family that would not let her be treated. It raised the unanswerable but essential question. In a different family, with a different father, in a later decade with real medicine, would Lucia Joyce have been ill at all? Or would she have been a dancer, an artist, a whole human being who lived out her own life? We will never know. That is the cruelty of it. But the question itself gave her back some part of what had been taken, her seriousness, her gift, her status as a person to whom something was done, rather than a symptom that simply happened. To understand the full weight of the loss, you have to go back, one last time, to the one thing that was truly hers, the dancing, and see what it really represented. For those few years in the 1920s, Lucia had found the single thing in her chaotic life that gave her form. Dance is the art of imposing order on the body, of making meaning out of pure motion, and, for a young woman who had grown up with no home, no country, no stable language, no ground, that was not a hobby. It was survival. On the stage, Lucia Joyce was not lost. She was not drifting. She was not the daughter in the doorway. She was the center of attention, in complete control of her own body, making something that was hers alone and that audiences rose to their feet for. The dance was the one place she was solid, and it was taken from her by her health, by her family's ambivalence, by the impossibility of training while being dragged across Europe in her father's wake, by her own sudden collapse of confidence. The exact moment the dancing ended is the moment the unraveling began. Strip away the diagnoses and the doctors and Jung's river and the whole apparatus of madness, and you can tell Lucia's story in a single brutal sentence. She found the one thing that held her together, and then she lost it, and nothing ever held her together again. Jung said her father was a diver, and she was a drowner in the same deep water. But there is another way to see it. Her father had his art to keep him afloat. The writing, the work, the books that gave his strange mind a structure and a purpose and a place to put the chaos. For 17 years, Finnegan's Wake was the vessel that carried James Joyce through the same dark water, that took his daughter down. He had a boat. He spent his life building it, plank by plank, word by word. Lucia had a boat too, once. It was called dancing, and the people who loved her let it sink. Lay it all out, and the deepest truth of Lucia Joyce's life comes clear. And it is not real. Why a story about madness at all? It is a story about what happens to a fragile person inside a great man's gravity. Everything in the Joyce household bent toward James. Joyce's genius, the moves, the money, the silence, the sacrifice, the very air. It was a field so strong that nothing else in that family could hold its own shape. Nora bent, Giorgio bent. And Lucia, the most sensitive of them, the one who shared her father's exact strange wiring, was bent the furthest of all bent until she broke. She could not build a self separate from his because the gravity was too strong. Even her one independent achievement, the dancing, existed in his shadow. Even the man she loved came to her home only because of him. Every door she tried to walk through had her father standing on the other side of it. And then, when she broke, that same gravity decided what her breaking meant. Her father said it meant genius. The doctors said it meant schizophrenia. Jung said it meant she had drowned in her father's depths. Her grandson said it meant private pain to be burned. At every stage, powerful people told the world what Lucia Joyce was. At no stage did the world simply listen to Lucia Joyce. That is the tragedy underneath the tragedy. Not that she was mad, we don't even fully know that she was, by modern standards. The tragedy is that she was never allowed to be the author of her own life. She was written by everyone around her, the way her father wrote his books, a character in other people's stories, the mad daughter, the lost dancer, the cautionary tale, the footnote, and when she tried at the very end to leave behind her own words, her own version, those words were thrown into a fire. The greatest writer of the century gave the world an ocean of language. His only daughter was not permitted to keep even a single sentence of her own. There is a pattern in this family, and it is not the pattern people expect. We are used to stories of great men who neglect their children, cold fathers, absent fathers, fathers too busy with greatness to notice the people at their feet. James Joyce was not that. The pattern here is stranger and more painful. A father who loved too possessively, too completely, in a way that left his daughter no room to exist apart from him. Joyce believed he and Lucia were one creative being, that his gift had passed into her, that her mind was his mind, that her breakdown was his genius in another form. It was the most flattering thing a father could believe about a daughter, and the most imprisoning. Because if Lucia's strangeness was really James Joyce's genius, then Lucia could never simply be Lucia, a young woman who was struggling, who was ill, who needed ordinary help. She had to be extraordinary, because being extraordinary was the only role the gravity of that household had on offer. There was no room in the Joyce family to be an ordinary person in pain. You were either a genius or you were nothing. And so the love itself became the trap. The closer Joyce held her, the more he insisted she was a visionary like him, the less she could be rescued, because rescue would have meant admitting she was just a sick young woman, and that was the one thing his love would not allow. The grandson inherited the same instinct in a different form: protect her by controlling her, define her by deciding for her, love her by refusing the world access to her. 3 generations of fierce, possessive, well-meaning love, and at the center of it, a woman slowly disappearing, loved so hard and so completely that there was nothing of her own left. The story of James Joyce is usually told as one of the great triumphs of modern art. The half-blind exile who reinvented the novel, who wrote Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, who pushed language further than anyone before or since. But that is not the whole story. And the part we leave out is the part that matters most to the people watching this tonight. The whole story includes a daughter, a gifted dancer whose audiences rose to chant her name, and who gave it up at 22. A young woman who loved a man who came to her house only to see her father. A patient examined by more than 20 doctors, including Carl Jung, while the one man with the power to insist on her treatment insisted instead that she was not ill. A woman who spent 30 years in an English asylum, far from every place she loved, visited by almost no one. And a voice that was deliberately burned, so the world would never hear it. And the lesson is not that James Joyce was a bad father. He was not. He loved her desperately. The lesson is harder and more useful than blame. And it reaches every one of us who has ever loved someone fragile. The lesson is that love is not the same as seeing. You can love a person with your whole heart and still refuse to see who they actually are. Refuse to see that they are struggling. Refuse to see that they need help, that you don't want them to need. Refuse to see them as a separate person with a life that is theirs and not yours. Joyce loved Lucia as an extension of himself, as a fellow genius, as a character in the great drama of his own mind. What he could not do was love her as Lucia ordinary, ill, frightened and savable, and that failure to see, dressed up as the deepest devotion, is what helped lose her. Somewhere in your life is a person you love who is not who you need them to be. The most loving thing you can do is not to insist they are extraordinary. It is to see them exactly as they are and to help them with what they actually need, even when that truth is smaller and sadder than the story you'd prefer to tell. At the beginning of this story, 3 things were promised. The young assistant who broke her heart with a single sentence was Samuel Beckett, the future Nobel laureate, who came to the Joyce apartment day after day and let Lucia believe he came for her, when in truth he came only to sit at the feet of her father. When he finally told her the truth in 1930, it knocked loose something in her that never went back into place. Beckett carried a quiet guilt about her for the rest of his long life, and at the very end, he too asked that his letters touching on Lucia be destroyed, adding his own hand to the silence around her. What Carl Jung said that the family could never forgive was his verdict that James Joyce and his daughter were diving into the same deep water, but that the father was swimming and the daughter was drowning. That the very mind Joyce celebrated as genius in Lucia was the thing pulling her under. That what the great writer could survive as art, his daughter could not survive at all. Joyce pulled her out of Jung's care, as he had pulled her from 20 doctors before, unable to accept a diagnosis that turned his gift into her curse. And the suitcase of letters, and what her own nephew did to them, was the destruction, in the 1980s, of Lucia's correspondence by Stephen Joyce, the writer's grandson, who burned the documents that held her voice, in the name of protecting her privacy. Whatever Lucia had to say about her own life, the dance, the love, the doctors, the 30 years went into the fire with them, ensuring that the woman the world remembers as a footnote could never speak for herself. A heart broken by a future Nobel Prize. A diagnosis the family could not bear. A voice turned to ash. This is what was left of the only daughter of the man who gave the 20th century its most ambitious words. Go looking for Lucia Joyce today, and here is what you will and will not find. You will find her father everywhere. Ulysses is read in universities on every continent. There are festivals in his honor, Bloomsday celebrations in Dublin where thousands walk the streets of his novel, statues, plaques, an entire global industry of Joyce scholarship. His grave in Zurich is a place of pilgrimage. His face is on coins and stamps and murals. The words he made are immortal, exactly as he intended. And then you will find Lucia if you look hard in a cemetery in Northampton, England. A grave in a town she never chose, in a country that was not her home, beside a hospital that held her for 30 years. No festivals, no pilgrims, no statue. For most of a century, just a line in someone else's biography. Joyce had a daughter, Lucia, who went mad. But if you go further back past the asylum, past the doctors, past Jung's River and Beckett's apology and the burned letters, you can still just catch her in a few surviving photographs and a handful of saved reviews. In a Paris dance studio in 1929, tall, fierce, electric, mid-motion. A young woman who had built, out of pure movement, the one solid thing she ever owned. An artist in her own right, with her own name, with a crowd on its feet shouting that name into the air. That is the Lucia the world was never supposed to remember. Not the patient, not the footnote, the dancer. Hold on to that one. It is the truest image of her that survives, and it is the one her father and her grandson and her century between them very nearly erased. There is a question this story does not answer. It is not whether James Joyce was a great writer. He was, beyond any argument, and nothing about Lucia's fate changes a word of it. The question is older and quieter, and it is the one Lucia lived out, wordlessly, across 75 years, and 30 of them locked away. What do we owe the fragile people we love, the ones who cannot keep up, who break where we bend, who need us to see them clearly instead of the way we wish they were? James Joyce answered that question with the fiercest love and the deepest blindness at once. He gave Lucia everything except the one thing she needed, to be seen as she actually was and helped accordingly, while there was still time. He spent a fortune on her and never once accepted what was wrong with her. He believed in her so completely that he could not save her. And here is the small, hard piece of grace at the bottom of it all. Because in the end, after the fire and the silence and the footnotes, a few people did go looking for the real Lucia, and they found her. Not the madwoman, the dancer, the artist, the whole human being. They could not give her back her life. But they gave her back her name, and her seriousness, and the truth that she had been a person, gifted and real, to whom something terrible was done. That recovery came 80 years too late for Lucia. But it is not too late for the fragile person in your own life. If this story moved you, there is a reason. Somewhere in your life, there is a person who is not keeping up. Someone you love who is struggling in a way that is inconvenient, or frightening, or hard to look at directly. Someone who doesn't fit the story you want to tell about them. A child who isn't who you imagined. A sibling who is coming apart. A parent slipping away. A friend who is drowning quietly while everyone around them carries on swimming. And the temptation, the deepest, most human temptation, is to do what James Joyce did, to insist they are fine, to insist they are special, not sick, to love them so hard in the shape you need them to take that you never actually see the person who is right in front of you, asking without words to be seen. Joyce loved his daughter more than almost anything in the world, and his love was a kind of blindness, and the blindness helped lose her for 30 years in a hospital in a foreign town. Don't love anyone the way he loved Lucia. Tonight, not someday, tonight think of the fragile person in your life, and do the thing Joyce could not do. See them as they actually are, not as you wish they were. Ask what they really need, even if the answer is smaller and harder and less flattering than the story you've been telling yourself. Get them the help you've been afraid to admit they need. Listen to their voice while you still can, before it goes silent, before it goes into the fire, before all that's left of them is a footnote in someone else's story. Lucia Joyce was a dancer, and a crowd once rose to its feet and chanted her name. Then the people who loved her most decided who she was allowed to be, and they kept deciding until there was nothing of her left but ash and a grave in a town she never chose. Don't decide who the people you love are allowed to be. See them, hear them, help them, while the music is still playing and they are still on their feet.